In my last video, I had mentioned the benefits of American settlement in the Midwest and throughout the Western United States. While they have great benefits, there are also costs associated with those already living there. And in the last video, I talked about the environmental damages of strip mining in California and in Nevada. In this video, I'm talking about the consequences for Native Americans of the rapid and continued spread of the United States and the population of the United States. Initially, Native Americans had hoped, or at least some of them had hoped, that the Midwest states and the Rocky Mountains would be a place where they could maintain their previous way of life, especially those who had been driven out of their previous lands or forcibly moved by the Americans across the Mississippi River in the first half of the 19th century. For most of the first half of the 19th century, or I suppose you would really say from in the middle of the 19th century, the focus of American settlers is not on the lands in the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains. The focus is on California, mining in California, and settlement in Oregon. Settlement in Northern California. And so in 1851, tens of thousands of Native American tribal members come together at Fort Laramie, in what today is Wyoming, to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which they agree to allow the United States Army to police certain corridors. To police certain corridors to protect settlers who are passing through their lands on the way to the West Coast. And they think that in this way they have established their security, that they have provided a way for American settlers to move through their lands unmolested by them, and for them to be unmolested by the settlers. Now this starts to change as we come into the second half of the 19th century. We find increasingly that settlers are settling on lands that were not agreed as part of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And that they are encroaching on lands that the Indians had thought would be theirs. And instead of defending these lands, the United States government increasingly starts to encourage Native American tribes to instead settle on land that is reserved for them by the United States government. And it's at this point that we start to see, in the 1870s really, that we start to see the United States government no longer treating the Native American tribes as independent nations, but increasingly starting to treat them as wards of the state. And the Native Americans know that that will be even more the case if they move to these reservations. That here they won't be able to live their traditional nomadic lives, but instead they'll be reliant on the US government for, in some instances, for food and for clothing. And so there's resistance to moving on to the reservations. But at the same time, the Native Americans of the Great Plains are increasingly seeing that their lives are being eroded away. And that's in large part because of the decimation of the buffalo populations. The buffalo populations that had provided them with food and clothing and everything they required to sustain their lives. Now, part of the reason why the buffalo population diminishes so dramatically in the second half of the 19th century is certainly the arrival of American settlers, American firearms, American hunting practices, where buffalo are hunted more extensively and perhaps more for sport or to feed large American populations on the East Coast than the Native Americans had hunted them. But it's also true that the buffalo population was diminished as a result of Native Americans using Western weapons and also hunting more buffalo than they had before. And that the buffalo now have to compete with other animals, like the settlers' cattle herds, in order to find the food that they require. And buffalo are such large animals that each animal requires a lot of food in order to survive, much more than an ordinary cow or bull would. And also that the 1880s and 1890s are a period of extensive droughts. And so there's less food anyway. And so modern historians recognize that while the arrival of the Western settlers certainly accelerated the decline of the buffalo and made the previous life of the Indians on the plains untenable, that this process probably would have happened anyway. In general, you would have seen, perhaps 10 or 20 years later, the same problems for these Native American populations. And so it's at this point when Native American tribes are struggling for food and supplies that you start to see more of them being willing to move on to reservations provided by the United States government. Some of these tribes nevertheless resist, in particular the Sioux Tribe, led by their chief Red Cloud, lead a war against American settlers who they see as encroaching on the terms of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And this war is somewhat successful. The Sioux win a number of victories, and the United States government agrees to give them a reservation on their own sacred lands, the Black Hills of South Dakota, rather than just kind of carving out territory that no one else wants, as had happened to other tribes. This agreement itself is breached only a few years later when gold is discovered in the Black Hills. Once gold is discovered, you find a whole rush of settlers coming to the Black Hills and encroaching on Native American lands. The U.S. Army tries to prevent this breach of the treaty with the Sioux, but is unable to enforce it. And this leads to an outbreak of the last great war between the Native American Indians and the United States Army, the Great Sioux War, which begins in 1876, where again the Sioux achieve a number of victories, most famously at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where they wipe out a rash U.S. cavalry force. But that in the end, the resources that the United States can bring to bear, in particular the strategies of total war which had been developed by Sherman and Grant in the Civil War, are now being applied to the Native Americans. And so the U.S. Army is destroying animal and plant populations and land that the Native Americans need to survive. This means that in the end, the Sioux are forced to surrender. In 1886, a chief named Geronimo, who was an Apache chief fighting in Texas, is one of the last remaining independent Native American leaders to agree to surrender, to agree to go on to a reservation. And so we have this ongoing, that's probably not quite accurate to describe it that way, but alongside this effort to corral the Native Americans into reservations is an effort on the part of the US government to kind of break them away from their culture. The most infamous are the Indian schools that are established, where Native American children are taken away from their parents to boarding schools where they're dressed like American settlers, where they're taught like American settlers, where they're even given new names, European-based names. And so this is a way of trying to break Native Americans away from their nomadic culture and to fully integrate them into American society. So you can look at it in two different ways. On one hand, there were probably well-intentioned people who thought that in the broad scheme of things, this was going to be the way to ensure that most Native Americans would be happy and successful, that they would adopt this Western way of life. And that may well be the case. But then there are also those who despised Native American culture at this time and wished to destroy it. So this is another of the consequences, one of the unhappy consequences of American settlement in the West. Alongside many good consequences, this is one of the unhappy consequences, the loss of the land of the Native Americans, the way that it was taken from them, and the injustices that they suffered.